Welcome to the Development Leadership Dialogue Conversation Series. Today we're very lucky to have Susan Hawley, Nicholas Shaxson, and Ricardo Soares de Oliveira, who are three experts on the issue of the political economy of offshore financial centers and tax havens. And today we want to discuss the implications that the evolution of offshore centers have had on the world economy, and particularly also on the prospects of development in less developed, low-income regions. The DLD is meant to bring people from different perspectives together. We want to bring people who are often not in the same room to discuss issues, but most of all, we want to move beyond debates, but to really encourage both the speakers and the audience to think about what might be feasible strategies to address the challenges that are identified in this conversation and in others. So without further ado, I will first of all pass the floor to Nicholas Shaxson, who is an author and journalist. He's known for his investigative works, including The Finance Curse and one of my favorite books of all time, which is Treasure Islands. He has written for Vanity Fair, the Financial Times, The Economist Intelligence Units, and many others. So he's also been a researcher and contributor to Tax Justice Network. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Nicholas.
I have got about 7 to 10 minutes, I was told. So I've only got about 10 slides, and I'm going to give quite a kind of conceptual look at what we're talking about. And I think Ricardo and Sue are probably going to be a bit more, close to the front line and in detail. So offshore finance, you can see it in many ways, but the way that I've chosen to show it here is a demand side and a supply side. So demand side is, local elites, kleptocrats, oligarchs, and so on. But also our whole kind of industry that has developed around handling this money and helping these people get their money out to somewhere else. And then there's the supply side, and there's the kind of private sector side, again, which is the same. There's a lot of overlap with the domestic enablers and the international enablers, the international bankers, lawyers, accountants, and consultants, and so on. That's the kind of private sector side. And then there's the kind of country aspect. And so my book, Treasure Islands, was very much about tax havens. They're called tax havens. We, in the Tax Justice Network, spent many years debating, is there a better term we can use? Because tax havens are not just about tax, they're about all sorts of different things. In my book, Treasure Islands, I boil the concept down to two words. One is escape and elsewhere. So you take your money, or sometimes yourself, somewhere else. You don't like the laws or tax rules or whatever, wherever you are, you take it elsewhere. And that's kind of, for me, the sort of central idea about what a tax haven is. There's lots of definitions out there, but I think that those two kind of ideas of escaping from rules you don't like, and going, crossing a border somehow to effect that escape is kind of the central way I think about tax havens. And so that enables, if you think about it in those terms, I spent quite a lot of time in Treasure Islands talking about how there was an escape from financial regulation. So Wall Street banks back in the 70s and onwards particularly used the City of London as an escape route. You can escape from privacy rules, and maybe we can have a discussion about how classic tax havens are now being havens for escaping the rules that govern surveillance capitalism. And so it's a whole kind of phenomenon, it's a whole political economy phenomenon that I am talking about. So I'm coming at this from a sort of political economy. If we're trying to work out what do we do about this, I'm focusing on the supply side, like rich countries and tax havens, the ones that are receiving the money. How do we change the dynamic where we open our doors to dirty money? And so I'm kind of boiling it down to these are sort of narratives that make it very difficult to do anything about offshore. So take the UK, for example. Everyone is kind of like, we don't like elites looting Africa and stashing them in the banks, but there's this other kind of whispering voice in the ear coming from the City of London saying, well, the money's coming to us and it's good for us and we get rich. And so, it's kind of a difficult thing to generate political action around. I mean, there's a lot of, there has been quite a lot of stuff that has been done, but this kind of inflow problem is a real kind of block to doing more serious stuff about offshore. So that's a kind of political conundrum. And often the result is just kind of window dressing. It's like, I've called it a theatre of probity. It's like a kind of performance that we're clean, well regulated, and you go to the Cayman Islands and talk to them, and they'll say we are clean, well regulated and stuff. And back in the 70s, they used to take in pallets of cash from drugs money and put it in their banks. And now they've stopped all that, but now it's all in private equity and hedge funds and that kind of stuff, which is also a very dirty game, but in a different way. But they've kind of, they certainly look a lot cleaner than they used to be. So that's one political conundrum. And the other one, which is kind of related to it, is this idea that capital is mobile and it can go anywhere. And if we don't do it, someone else will. It's not going to help if we don't, it'll just flow to Dubai or wherever. So, and the kind of implication of this is like, if states are kind of competing, I call it the competitiveness agenda. It's this idea that we're competing. There's all this mobile capital around there. We're trying to attract it, and one way to attract it is to create a sort of secrecy loophole, so that nobody, a trust, a particularly impenetrable trust law that will enable dodgy people to kind of hide their money, and another country might look at that and say, oh, we can do something even better. And there is also a dynamic where countries want to appear clean and actually sell themselves as kind of responsible actors. So you don't want to send your money to somewhere that's completely dodgy, you can't trust. You want to send it somewhere that you can trust. And there's this kind of balance between wanting to appear clean but wanting to take in dirty money. And there's this kind of game going on. But this is a political dynamic. If we don't do it, someone else will, and we need to stay in the race. I remember immediately after the Panama Papers hit, I went to Transparency International, in all its wisdom, had a conference in Panama City, and all these politicians trooping up and saying, yes, we must really clean up, and then there was already be a but we must stay competitive, and I was like, yeah, okay, we want to clean up, but not really. So there's what I call this competitiveness agenda, this idea that we must be competitive, we must kind of keep attracting the money. And this is a political conundrum, and it's very pervasive out there in the media. Like, we need to protect the City of London, we need to protect the financial centre. And that is a huge political block if we want to do something about offshore. So, can we cut are these Gordian knots that we can cut? Well, in a conceptual way, I would say yes. Obviously, the details of how we go about it is rather more complicated. But I want to give the image of two different kinds of food, and this is a way of talking about what I call the finance curse. So, how am I on time, by the way? Am I okay? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay. Okay. So, my first journalistic book was about oil and politics in West Africa. That's where I got to know Ricardo. And I was investigating what academics began to call the resource curse. And the resource curse kind of had a weak version and a strong version. And the resource curse, the weak version is, okay, you've got producing all this oil, there's all this corruption and the elites nick it, and the oil doesn't contribute to development. That's kind of the weak version. The strong version is, yes, that happens and it's important, but it's worse than that. This dominant oil sector is actually inflicting harm on your economy. And I started out as a journalist in Angola during the civil war there, and for sure the oil was harming Angola for many reasons. Again, it's quite conceptual, but there's a huge brain drain out of the oil sector, out of other parts of the economy, into the oil sector. And so all the best and brightest people get sucked out into this dominant sector that pays much better. You get these kind of Dutch disease price effects where, inflows of oil money will raise overall general price levels. So kind of tradable goods like agriculture find it much harder because the whole price level is higher and rents are more expensive. It's harder for them to compete on the world economy. And of course you get, all this money flowing at the top of a political system generates great corruption and fragmentation. So there's this is a sort of resource curse concept. So I moved on to write this book called The Finance Curse, and to give the simplest overview, a tax haven, so my book about Treasure Islands, a tax haven is a financial centre that kind of transmits harm outwards to other countries. So if you are, Brazilian elites might loot the the healthcare system and stash it in the Cayman Islands. So what you have is the Cayman Islands is transmitting harm to Brazil because it's facilitating this corrupting thing. So tax haven transmitting harm outwards. The core concept of the finance curse is that too much finance and the wrong kind of finance transmits harm inwards to your own financial sector, your own economy. And I would argue very strongly that the UK is suffering from this finance curse. And there's a whole lot of research, there's a lot more research needs to be done that has this kind of banana-shaped graph on it. And it's basically on the x-axis you have some measure of kind of prosperity, and on the y-axis you have some measure of kind of financial development, how big your financial centre is. And so the idea is if we all need a financial centre because it supports other parts of the economy, helping people buy houses or financing small businesses or, transforming savings into investment. So this is kind of the useful stuff. And so if a country's financial centre is underdeveloped, you can develop it further, and you can, it will help, it will boost your well-being, your national kind of prosperity. But there comes a point where the financial sector is kind of doing the good stuff that it needs to be doing, but then it keeps developing. And then if it's no longer doing the stuff it needs to be doing, it starts getting more kind of harmful and predatory. And so more finance, it's kind of a paradox, more finance means lower growth, means less prosperity, means however you want to measure it. So again, it's a very sort of conceptual thing, but there's plenty of kind of graphs out there in the literature, and of course it's contested and there's vested interest pushing back against it and so on. So that's the banana. And the fried egg, so the banana was kind of like about kind of how much finance. This is sort of about the quality of finance. So you have the useful stuff, the kind of the yolk, the nutritious yolk, and then you have the more predatory stuff. And the sort of and so there's all sorts of things going on here in the bad part of finance, and I don't think that would be at all controversial. It's just one way of conceiving it. And the kind of political message from this is, again, it's this kind of paradoxical idea. You can shrink finance and you'll be better off. So less finance means more money for us. And that kind of overturns the idea in people's minds, the political idea that's so pervasive that we can't touch the financial sector because that's where the money is. And if we chase all these clever financiers away, we'll be poorer. And offshore is one of those very important components of the bad stuff. And so this, again, there's loads of studies and stuff being done, but particularly since the global financial crisis. I think this graph is from the Resolution Foundation. I didn't put it in, sorry. But here you can see the red line that kind of goes, this is the UK sort of along with everybody else, and this is the sort of financial crisis time, and now the UK is doing much worse, or significantly worse than its peers. And finance is clearly a part of this picture. The UK has suffered, and the UK does much worse on many measures of well-being than its peers, than its kind of comparable countries, particularly since the global financial crisis. So that's kind of like it's sort of an indicator of the financial sector in the UK may be too big. Investment levels in the UK tend to be lower than its peers. You would think a financial sector would be the one, a country with a big financial centre would be able to invest more than anybody else, but the UK is doing worse. So there's a whole kind of dynamics. The usual caveat, lots more research is needed. But the point I want to make is if we're worried about doing something about offshore, and the UK is particularly important because it's not only a kind of inflow country in its own right, but it also has this network of tax havens that are sort of partly British. The British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, all these Jersey, Guernsey, all these kind of British. You can think of them in some ways as kind of collecting vessels, bringing money into the city to be handled. But so starting with the conundrum that I began, we don't like Africa being looted, but the inflows benefit us. If we take on the finance curse kind of logic, we can flip that upside down. So we don't like Africa being looted, and these particular kinds of inflows hurt us. We can construct that story. We have a politically more kind of powerful way of tackling the kind of offshore narrative. And it's the same with the second conundrum. The finance curse kind of, too much finance is bad for us, helps us counteract this offshore dynamic. So I'm sorry this is very, very abstract, but the last thing I wanted to say is that the too much finance issue is actually something we can think about in terms of constituencies and financialization. And so there's a lot of people know about the role of private equity firms in care companies, for example, and there's a lot of stuff at water companies, Thames Water and so on. The way I see them from a kind of political economy point of view is that all of these different groups that are being harmed by too much finance are kind of allies. And if we're going to fight offshore, it's kind of part of a package. And there's an awful lot of allies that if we think creatively about how to address offshore and the inflows from an inflow perspective, we can find a lot of allies and create a kind of coherent story that brings us all together. And of course, a research agenda that can push this forward. So there we have it. Sorry, that was a very abstract, but that's my contribution.
Okay, now Sue Hawley is next. She's an anti-corruption expert who has researched and campaigned on the UK's role in facilitating global corruption for over 20 years. She's the founder of Spotlight on Corruption, having previously worked at Corruption Watch, the Corner House, and Christian Aid on corruption issues. Sue?
Yes, great. Thank you very much for coming along, and great to be here with such illustrious company. So I thought I'd talk about a very specific example, and I thought Ricardo would be touching on his expertise in Africa, so I would look at Bangladesh, which is, some of you, if you're at SOAS, will know Mushtaq Khan has done a lot of extraordinary work on Bangladesh, and I wanted to do lots of nice fancy graphs like Nick, but I could only manage a photo on the first page, I'm afraid. Bangladesh is it's a super fascinating example of how offshore played a role in the downfall of, well, I say nearly broke because it's not yet a downfall. There's a government in place, an interim government trying to bring it back, but this time last year, Bangladesh was being touted as a major success story, particularly by bodies like the World Bank and IMF. And it had gone from the second poorest country in the world, 1971, to a country that had cut poverty in half, 25 million people lifted out of poverty, brilliant, education and health transformations. And it was even talking about it was going to become an upper middle income country by 2031. And a developed country by 2041, and the IMF and World Bank were all behind this. This was going to happen. Few sticky moments. They needed an IMF bailout of nearly $5 billion just after COVID. And as part of that, they were going to tackle corruption, and everyone said, very nice, we're going to tackle corruption. And then just in August 2024, the Prime Minister of the country, Sheikh Hasina, who'd ruled the country since 2009, her government collapsed and she fled the country after massive student protests. And the student protests started around a decision to have a quota system for particular groups associated with the governing party for government jobs, but it became much wider, mainly because of corruption as well as human rights and political persecution. And it really, no one thought this would happen, but it spiraled into huge countrywide protests. A lot of people killed, over 1,000 people were shot by the troops trying to defend Hasina. And really a lot of this was actually discontent around corruption. So could anyone have predicted this was going to happen? I am coming back to offshore at some stage, don't worry. So actually there were lots of warning signs. So back in 2022, Global Financial Integrity found that Bangladesh was losing nearly over $8 billion a year to illicit financial flows. Transparency International Bangladesh had, said it was 3.1 billion a year, and then they raised that more recently to 12 to 15 billion a year. We had work in 2017 by Mushtaq Khan, who warned that the rapid economic growth of Bangladesh is unlikely to continue without limit because of the corruption and the governance issues. And I wanted to put this quote here because I think it's really important that this was before Hasina's government fell, that a Bangladeshi academic specifically highlighted that the biggest hindrance to Bangladesh getting sustainable development was actually not corruption happening at home and it being invested at home, but actually when you have corruption where the money gets laundered abroad. And once it's outside the country, it's almost impossible to get back. And that is the role that offshore plays, the black hole it goes into. So what really has emerged since Sheikh Hasina's government fell is like a really extraordinary tale of corruption and looting of the banks. And there were other startling facts, like that actually it looked like the national statisticians had been captured by the political elite and were inflating the GDP figures. You might want to tell Rachel Reeves this is a good tactic. There was some suggestion that it inflated by 3.5% and had even been manipulating poverty reduction figures as well. But the really big thing to come out of this was the banking sector, and it had been completely decimated by corruption and illicit financial flow. So here are some of the stats. 10 banks have been left technically bankrupt. 30% of the whole country's loans were in default and probably unrecoverable. And half of those loans had belonged to just a handful of very politically connected people who had, with government support and sometimes with the military support, marched in and taken over banks and then happily given out loans to their families, to their companies, to themselves, often undocumented projects, sometimes used bribes to get their loans from other banks, and then use their political influence to get these loans rescheduled, restructured, or written off. And so the Yunus government, and actually if anyone's around next week, he is speaking at Chatham House about the challenges that Bangladesh faces. Might be worth going along to, but they've been left with a £40 billion black hole, which the white paper that was commissioned by his government said could have built 14 metro systems in Dhaka and 24 major bridges. Not sure why you'd want 14 metro systems in Dhaka, but anyway, how did this happen? I think this is like a quite fascinating snapshot into how offshore enabled this bank looting to happen. So I'm just going to tell you about one, and I'm not mentioning the names because these are extremely litigious people. And we'll come on to that. But just one of these politically connected oligarchs alone allegedly siphoned off $10 billion from the banking system and was pretty much responsible for a severe liquidity crisis. And again, as I mentioned earlier, with the military and officials, he had managed to take over a bank and he'd managed to get to kind of rewrite and reschedule loans, and he'd made loans to himself about nearly $5 billion. And at the same time, he was happily building a business empire in Singapore, about at least $1 billion worth of property and business, hotels, retail space, 2 homes. And how he did this, he set up 18 shell companies in the British Virgin Islands, and he also bought property assets in Singapore. He had trusts and companies created in Singapore and Cyprus. And this was all despite extremely tough laws in Bangladesh that you couldn't move money outside of Bangladesh without approval from the Bangladesh Bank. So the Bangladesh Bank had been completely politically captured as well. And maybe it'll turn out that, there were benefits for the bankers who turned a blind eye or let this happen. Another really major feature is a citizenship. The individual got citizenship in Cyprus. Other Bangladeshi oligarchs have had, citizenship from St Kitts and Nevis. It's a very well-worn pattern. And at each stage of this process, there are lawyers, company service providers, and financiers involved. And just to show you the kind of wealth protection industry, when the current Bangladesh central governor named this individual in an interview with the Financial Times, there was a big backlash, and he employed a top-notch London firm, which I will name, it's called Quinn Emanuel, and they threatened to do arbitration against the Bangladesh government if they even tried to suggest that any of this had been illicit or do anything about it. So I think it gives you quite a big, good picture. He's not unique. The Guardian and Transparency International identified £400 million of the property in the UK, owned by several other oligarchs, including a land minister who was on a salary of the equivalent of £10,000 a year. The same land minister has around 500 properties in Dubai, the US, many cases using companies in the Virgin Islands, companies in Dubai. And all of these cases are just classic. It's just quite a good illustration of what we know, right? Everyone who works in this field knows how it works. The UK has often been at the centre of this. And just to give you an example of, David Lammy made a major speech before Labour came into government, and he identified that between Britain and its offshore territories, we represent 31.5% of the global architecture facilitating corporate tax haven jurisdictions. Is that one of your stats?
Not one of mine.
No. He also 3 out of 4 of the offshore jurisdictions with the highest risk of involvement with international corruption are the UK overseas territories. So what are we going to do about it? Labour promised to clean this up, but we are already hitting what Nicholas identified as the, let's do something about it. It's one of David Lammy's 2 personal priorities in office. And the government are announcing lots of anti-money laundering reforms. They strengthen enforcement. They're using the anti-corruption sanctions a little, but more than was happening under the last government. But there are 2 things. One of them is that this is a global problem. And the other is that, as Nick identified, the other agenda is to grow and get investment at all costs. And I was just talking to Ricardo before coming in that there was another more recent speech by David Lammy where he said all ambassadors, UK ambassadors, will be judged in their performance at work by how much trade and investment they bring for the UK. So just giving you a very clear example of that, Georgia, a country descending into autocracy, dictatorship, repression, very much like Belarus. The UK government have sanctioned some people and said this is terrible. On the other hand, their former ambassador was introducing Georgian companies to the London Stock Exchange and encouraging investment in Georgia. Time's up, and we can discuss a major international summit that might happen next year and whether it's going to produce any results.
Last but not least, we have Ricardo Soares de Oliveira, who is a professor of political science at Sciences Po in Paris. He's written several books on Africa, on the resource curse, and he's currently writing a book called Africa Offshore, the Global Offshore Economy and the Reshaping of African Politics.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm very happy to be here today, to be here with Sue and with Nick. Thank you to the team in the global leadership, global development dialogues for inviting me to be here today. My very brief comments, they're in a way seeking to stimulate a broader conversation. They're quite preliminary. I'd like to speak about the ongoing fight back against offshore and what it means for development across the global south, and as John hinted, specifically at sub-Saharan Africa. Because I think that there's been a flurry of initiatives in recent years since publics across the world came to understand offshore more. Knowledge came in spasms. Early in the century, there were discussions about terrorist finance. There were scandals about corporate tax avoidance by Western multinationals. There were stories about hidden kleptocratic money. But especially after the 2008 financial crisis, the extent of offshore practices in the global financial system became much clearer through the work of activists, of investigative journalists, of academics. And I think much of this culminates in the 2006 Panama Papers leaks and other later leaks, some of them much more ambitious in size and fine-grained detail than the Panama Papers were, but perhaps didn't get as much news interest as the initial leaks did. But I think some of these reverberated worldwide, and the result was a clampdown on some of the more outrageous offshore practices via a series of global initiatives focused especially on anti-money laundering and tax evasion. While not specifically aimed at offshore financial centers, measures such as the US FATCA or the OECD's Common Reporting Standards have had some impact. And we also have, of course, particular initiatives primarily driven from the Global South, such as the UN Global Tax Convention. But in addressing these changes, we're faced with a paradox, which is that this era of what I would argue is not completely fraudulent, not completely non-negligible reformism, also coincides with the exponential and unimpeded growth of Africa's links with the offshore world. So that's the paradox I'd like to address in these brief comments, especially through the viewpoint of how different stakeholders in this global question have addressed this. And I guess my key argument is that there is, in fact, quite a deeply seated ambivalence by pretty much everyone involved in global governance around offshore, and not just the usual suspects. And because of that deep-seated ambivalence, the results are pretty modest and unlikely to result in transformational change to the offshore world. Let me take this in stages. Both Sue and especially Nick in his early comments already made the case for me that Western states are not wholeheartedly sincere about this, the last decade of reformism. I don't want to discount it entirely, and I've started by saying that some of these reforms are useful, notably in terms of financial governance, but I would at least highlight 2 or 3 dimensions that should give us pause about the extent to which the leading Western states, and for the sake of argument, I'm considering here primarily Switzerland, the UK, and the US. The US, even before the Trump administration, has engaged in a wholesale reverse of the US commitment to global offshore reform. Even during the Biden administration, you see a discrepancy between what's happening at the federal level, which is perhaps sincere and perhaps impactful, and what was happening at the level of states, specific states in the US. I'm thinking here not just of the historical Delawares, but of Nevada, of Wyoming, Oregon, South Dakota. South Dakota's trust funds reportedly hold hundreds of billions of dollars. It's extremely non-transparent. So we have, in a way, an offshore world developing within the United States ecosystem itself for the last 10, 15 years. In the UK, remarkable progress, but at the same time, campaigners having to undergo the experience of slaps, unexplained wealth orders having backfired over the last 5 years, and difficulties or lack of political will, we can discuss that, in ultimately reining in the overseas territories and crown colonies, even when decision makers here in the UK, you mentioned Foreign Secretary Lamy, I think Andrew Mitchell in the previous Conservative government was also a sincere articulator of the reform agenda. But even then, it's difficult to push forward. In the case of Switzerland, you see, for instance, 2 major sectors that were essentially ridden with impunity until a decade ago. I'm thinking here of commodity trading and wealth management, engaging in some significant reform, or at least media exposure, that has made the sector, that's made Switzerland less amenable to the worst practices in these two sectors. So there is some amount of reformism, but I think it's very, 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 very punctuated not only by restrictions, but I think also in this sort of, I see into the next set of actors, which is a set of new offshore financial centers, primarily in Asia, which is that professional services in the UK, in the US, in Switzerland, etc., are extraordinarily capable and endlessly inventive, and have, in one word, reacted to some of the restrictions that I've just described here, modest as they may be, by offshoring the enabling to other more permissive jurisdictions. And that's where I think places like Dubai, places like Singapore, places like Hong Kong, in the case of Chinese corporations, play an important role. Again, I am not saying for a moment here that the problem is no longer in the global West, but rather elsewhere, because the realities of what you see today happening in Dubai, these are multi-jurisdictional realities. If you are a politically exposed person, say from Nigeria, you will buy real estate in Dubai frequently through the same schemes as your Bangladeshi oligarchs by using a company in the British Virgin Islands. And key point here, a lot of the service providers who are servicing high net worth individuals out of the new Asian jurisdictions are the same household names that we know from our own Western jurisdictions. Look at the exponential growth in the footprint and business activities of the top 5 wealth managers from Switzerland in Dubai, especially in the last 5 years. This is not a generational trend. You compare the numbers with 5-10 years ago, and it's through the roof. I even have an interview, which will be in my forthcoming book, with an African high net worth individual who, approaching one of his lawyers here in London, was met with the response, "Come meet us in Dubai." In other words, there are certain things that we are now doing from other places. So again, the reality in these new Asian jurisdictions is also a Western reality. But I'm not underemphasizing for a second the extent to which the authorities in these contexts are also amenable. They're actively soliciting some of this activity, notably from sub-Saharan Africa. I don't have time to go into another set of deeply ambivalent actors, the BRICS, but suffice it to say that they are avid users of the offshore world. Russia has been so since the 1990s, as we know, but particularly since 2022, its economy would probably not survive Western sanctions without the subterfuges of the offshore world. Brazil is, I think, the second largest borrower in offshore markets. China's state-owned enterprises are, according to some research, outliers in the use of offshore financial centers as transit jurisdictions for FDI, for foreign direct investment, into places like Africa, like African economies. They don't just do it as much as others do it. They do it more for reasons that we can discuss. So the reason for this is that beyond some very pious references to denouncing the Western-built financial system in, for instance, BRICS summit statements, there's very little willingness to engage in systemic reform of the offshore world. But I would argue that this ambivalence extends, unfortunately, to some global South states, and also, in the case specifically of my comments here, to Africa. And the reason for that, obvious reason, is that some African elites benefit personally from these arrangements. What is, negative in terms of national development, and I think we assume here that offshore practices are detrimental for broad-based development in sub-Saharan Africa. From a micro-sociological and class perspective, they amount to an expansion of options, to a form of liberation into the international economy that is unprecedented in the pre-offshore world. So some elites approach the idea of reform with some ambivalence. they also see their own economies as ridden with political risk. In so far as, for instance, the people that come next look at Angola, Isabel dos Santos, richest woman in sub-Saharan Africa. Her father's successor, she was the daughter of the President dos Santos. When his successor came in, her interests were frozen and she was legally persecuted. The message is that if you are a former incumbent who built up stakes in whatever way, that you're not safe, and you need a safe haven to put your assets to weather off political risk. But finally, there are reasons for African decision makers, which I don't agree with, but there are reasons why there's a legitimate understanding that offshore may be necessary. And that is the idea that has become widespread since the 1990s, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but in other frontier market contexts. Think Burma, think Vietnam, think Laos, in the case of Southeast Asia, that frontier markets will only get serious FDI if they use not only offshore jurisdictions to mediate that investment, but specifically in the case of Africa, if those investments run through jurisdictions that have double taxation agreements. And that's why so much investment into Africa, oil mining and gas, comes through places like Mauritius, places like Dubai, etc., etc. I think that's an argument. The idea that African states need offshore, whether they like it or not, has become, second nature to a lot of decision-making processes, notably around oil, gas, and mining, and is really impacting on the way FDI flows into sub-Saharan Africa. Let me just finalize these comments by picking up three potential scenarios. What does this mean for Africa? And I think I'm just going to mention the scenarios, and perhaps this is of interest to you, and I can develop these ideas further in the Q&A. One is that Africa goes offshore. It does what others have done. Africa develops its own offshore tools. The actual empirical record of that is very poor. I've counted about 14 different attempts by African states in the last 50 years to develop, especially in the last 15, 20 years, of developing financial centers of some way or the other. The only ones that have done so successfully are Mauritius and Seychelles. Mauritius in a quite respectable way at the end of the day. Seychelles less so. Seychelles is currently thriving again on the crypto front, but others have seen significant difficulties in occupying that space. The second scenario is that Africa engages in a real collective fight against offshore, that it seeks global change in financial structures. Again, as I mentioned before, this deep-seated ambivalence that is multi-stakeholder for different reasons, global north, global south, global west, the private sector, the professional enablers. There seem to be very few constituencies that are wholeheartedly pro-reform. In terms of African politics, those that are include a very courageous African civil society and investigative media organization. They're certainly not ambivalent and have made a key contribution to our understanding of these dynamics, but mostly everyone else is. So what are the conditions under which African collective action and global enlightened action could drive systemic change? And the third one is things remain the same. And on this assumption, the offshore world would neither be extinguished nor even significantly curtailed by the actions of states, multilateral organizations, and non-state actors. It will continue to evolve into sectoral, technical, and geographical dimensions of striking and unexpected originality. If this is right, we need to think of the future of African economies and political trajectories in a context where offshore remains vitally robust, indeed expansive. If this is indeed the most likely scenario, and I'm not telling you that it is, but I think this is a conversation we should have, we need to ask ourselves whether there is a future for broad-based African development, and if not, what sort of developmental alternatives beckon for Africa. Thank you.
Ricardo. So we have about 45 minutes or 50 minutes. We started a little late for Q&A. I just wanted to make a couple brief points or reflections on this field. I mean, one of them is the issue of the extent to which offshore generates a sort of discourse around the financing gap for poor countries. So there's this idea that, Africa needs X number of $1 trillion to be able to meet the demands of green industrialization, for example. And there's a big discourse around debt relief that goes with that. One of the problems I see politically of that gaining traction is that there are a lot of African elites and high-income earners that have more money abroad in offshore than the debt of the continent. Matter of fact, it's probably something like double. I mean, estimates of different organizations estimate between $2 and $2.5 trillion of assets are held abroad by African citizens. That's very difficult to convince people, taxpayers in the global north, to give up money when very privileged people in Africa are holding this. And I was offshore responsible for that? Or is it a byproduct of domestic politics? It seems to me an area of ambiguity that would make it very difficult to gain traction around debt relief and things like that. That's the first thing. The second issue I'd like to put out there is something Albert Hirschman brought up a long time ago. Offshore can create an exit. So whenever there's a problem, money flees a country. And Hirschman, in his very famous book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, argued that when you exit a system, you don't use your voice because you don't have a stake in it, right? And one of the detrimental effects of offshore is that a lot of elites, particularly in Africa, don't have a lot of their wealth and stakes in the continent, and therefore they're less likely to use their voice and dialogue to influence government to come up with predictable, productive strategies. And every time there's a crisis, money flees. So offshore can be harmful because it's deinstitutionalizing or not allowing the institutionalization of state elite dialogue around production strategies because no one has a stake in it. One of the reasons why capital controls in the past were effective in developmental states is because elites couldn't put their money anywhere else. They had to dialogue to make money with the government. They had to dialogue with the government to be able to influence production strategies so they could make money domestically. And the last point I'd like to put out there is, in a region like Africa, there's this talk about offshore and all the money abroad, but a big story about offshore is this idea of round tripping. So a lot of elites in China and Vietnam and so on will send hundreds of billions of dollars abroad, put it in tax havens or offshore centers, partially for regulatory reasons, not just tax evasion, and not even mostly tax evasion, a lot of research points out, because they want to have their FDI registered in a jurisdiction where they trust the judicial system, which is the point that Ricardo was bringing up. So it's kind of a way of reducing the transaction costs of doing business. The question that I think is important for research to answer is, why is some place like Vietnam and China have 90% of the money that leave come back, whereas 90% of the money that leaves Africa does not? That tells you something. That is it because there's not enough trust in the system, there are not enough bankable projects, there's not a predictable industrial policy. So it turns our attention to the domestic political economy as the reason why there's not round tripping, as opposed to just looking at offshore as the reason why you have financing problems and a financing gap in the continent. I put that out there as a question to debate. I don't know the answer to it, but I do think there's too little discussion of how domestic and political economy affects the extent to which there's actual round tripping that comes back in real productive investment. China and Vietnam live in this globalized, financialized world. They have 35 to 40% investment rates in that world. So obviously it's possible. And so we need to explain why that's happening. So I'm going to stop here, and we're going to open it up 3 questions at a time for any of the panelists.
Can we also
But you can also
react to your stuff?
You can also react. Maybe now we'd like to, or wait. We'll wait. Why don't we start with 3 questions and we'll intersperse. And if no one has one, gentleman here, yeah.
So just a more, I won't pursue it offshore, to spotlight corruption. There's an argument that the loss of resources is almost a lesser problem even though it's huge. Stefan Durkheim would say it's more the effect on the governance and the politics in countries which is losing the resources. So I'm interested in to what extent you think that's true and what's the mechanism by why that happens. So beyond the losing resources, what's the impact on the governance and how does that happen?
Christopher?
Hi, thank you all very, very much. Nick, you give me indigestion. I'm sort of, my lunch is coming back with the fried egg and the banana. So I just wanted to, I don't really have a question,
pie as well.
but I'm wanting you to expand a little bit on a couple of things. First is banana. Well, I want to know where the UK is on the banana, but also it's one thing to talk about associations. And I don't disagree with the story, and I want to believe it, and I do believe it, but maybe it'd be useful to expand a little bit on the mechanisms and how we know about the deleterious effects of outsized financial sector and so on and so forth. I think that might be helpful, and then well, it's got that part of it as well, but also on the fried egg. You talked, and back to your initial point, when you begin and you talk quite rightly about escape and about borders, it can set up an idea that this is about, I don't know, money from one place crossing to another. It's about international border hopping jurisdictions. And surely the point here is there are many borders. There are borders between the licit and the illicit. There are borders within countries. And the whole thing is a very complex sort of web of porous borders rather than, you know, Simon's got his money in this little place and he's transferring it to me because I've got the international tax haven, etc. So just to expand a little bit on those issues, if you will.
Anyone else for now? Okay, well, we can, yeah.
So I'll add quickly as well. So I think, I agree with a lot of what's been said, and it's really interesting to contributions. I think from the work that we've been doing, we work with large corporations in South and East Africa from a competition and market power point of view, and the elites have all externalized their money. I don't think it really helps to call them African any longer. They're just elites, right? So I have an issue about this kind of name. I'm sure it's helpful, but also the companies that hold most of the multinationals that hold assets in different countries are in Dubai or Mauritius. So AB InBev, which produces beer and sells it, and it invests and it produces more and more beer, so it is investing. Everything outside South Africa is held in Mauritius. East African breweries similarly, which is Diageo. So I think I think we should be thinking about the world where this is normal, and then the question is how to mobilize different constituencies. And in that mobilization of constituencies, I would really be interested in thinking about how we can make the relationship between the development patterns in a particular sector of the economy, such as food and agriculture, and the corporate control and strategies for around those investments. And these companies, they've totally internalized all of this. This is not the person coming to London saying, "Come and talk to me in Dubai." Carlo, they're in Dubai. Everything's there. It's like this is it. Their strategies are all based on this structure. So I think we've moved into that world already, and we're still talking about the previous world of "come and talk to me" in Seychelles, or as if
No one is in the Seychelles. No one's actually there.
No, I know that.
They're in Dubai.
They're in Dubai. Well, there. Yeah. So I like that link between those corporate decision making and the rules. I think those links. I'd like to know much more about that.
Okay, that's the first round of three, so I'll leave it to you to answer which ones you'd like to. So, yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to answer your question about the UK and damaging effects of oversized finance. There is, of course, no precision about this, and there's a lot of subjectivity. There are quite a few of the studies, the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, kind of came up with a number that when credit to the economy is worth 100% of GDP, then you're kind of at the top of the banana. And I'm not sure. I wasn't able to find if it was the same database, but I'm pretty sure it is the same database that, like, the Fred database in the US comes up for the UK with a figure of like 150 to 160% of GDP. So quite a long way along the graph. But so down the bad side of the banana. But the other way to look at it is the completely uncontroversial way. There are lots of very harmful parts of the financial sector, and I'm sure we could all come up with horror stories of, everyone's aware of what's been happening with Thames Water and the kind of financialised model of water utilities in the UK. And so there's kind of a lot of levels of politically significant anecdotes like that. And I think one of the things that hasn't really happened is that there's a lot of horror stories about care homes and some studies of the financialisation of care homes. Thames Water is probably the best known one. And every now and then scandals come up, but it hasn't yet really coalesced into a kind of unified field theory of financialisation of finance, into which I would say that offshore kind of nasty, dirty money inflows, which pose national security risk and all sorts of other risks, fit. And so just from a kind of political economy perspective, I would say that, so you kind of look at it from both ends of the telescope. One is the big macro, so those banana-shaped graphs are kind of cross-country comparison studies. But then if you can relate it directly to people, and if you do a journalistic job, you find a person in a care home who's having a terrible time, and then you can kind of build out from that of all the kind of financial structures on top of that care home, and there's kind of money that's being sucked out, and why the workers are having to work harder because there've been these special dividends to the private equity firms. So there's a whole kind of, I think, again, kind of thinking politically, what resonates with people is individual human stories. Who was it who said that if 1 million people die, that's a statistic, but if one person dies, or 5 people die, it's... Who was Stafford, okay. But anyway, but there's just different levels of kind of political, ability to kind of reach people and the political kind of the conversation. And I think you can, with finance, you need to do it at all different levels. And I think it is happening at these different levels. So you have these abstract banana-shaped studies that a few wonks look at, and then you have some other people who are, really angry about what's happening to their grandmother. And but the connection is not really properly being made. And I think it's really important to kind of start knitting these things together. As part of the broader push against kind of neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it.
So, very interesting question, including from Jonathan's comments. Very quickly on round tripping. I think this is something that came up in the event that you and Chris organized already in February. We had a good conversation about this. There are some exceptions in sub-Saharan Africa. I would think of Nairobi and South Africa as at least, this is not round tripping in the sense that Somali money doesn't go back to Somalia via Nairobi, but it does stay in sub-Saharan Africa, notably in the real estate sector. Same with Cape Town, same with Joburg for Southern African money. But those are exceptions. Mostly the money just leaves Africa. It doesn't come back as FDI, but it doesn't come back in any shape, not in a significant way. And in that regard, the difference, not just with the Chinese story that you mentioned, but the Indian story, the way Mauritius was, at least until 2016, a significant sort of pull for round-tripping FDI back into India. I think Africa is, in that sense, an outlier and a problematic one. The question that both you and Justin's question on what does it do to states, I think if elites exit the system, they don't engage in the sort of conventional institutional building and more generally state formation that we not only would expect theoretically, but you saw in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, until at least the African crisis in the late 20th century. There was some post-colonial investment in the quality of the educational system, the quality of health, the quality of universities. A lot of privileged Nigerians went to university in Ibadan in the 1960s or 70s. But if you actually compare this with the data that Carnegie put forward in 2021, a great paper called West African Elites Spending on UK Schools and Universities, it starts with schools. It's not universities, it's high schools. And we're talking about billions. So it's that form, when you say that they're not African, they're elites, they're certainly globalized to a remarkable extent. And this takes place through two important mechanisms. One is in cases of elites that had historically very close relationships with former colonial states. I'm thinking specifically of France and Portugal. It was easy, at least until a certain point, for the elites of the Lusophone and Francophone countries to get Portuguese and French citizenship. You know, it's an open secret in Angolan politics that Angolan elites are carriers of Portuguese passports. But more recently, you've had the development of a thriving, British-aided through Henley Partners, thriving global business, not just in golden visas, but in golden passports. And I would urge you to read the wonderful book that my colleague Tristan Surak at the LSE wrote called The Golden Passport. And African elites are some of the biggest clients because they want good quality passports, better quality passports than the ones they have. Historically, again, the St. Kitts and Nevises and all of these microstates. But in the last 5 years, the real champion in golden passports, and again, this is citizenship, this is not golden visas, is Turkey. Came out of nowhere and became perhaps the world leader. And there's a whole African pipeline for Turkish passports now. Again, this is really going to the heart of what elites, including self-interested elites, are meant to do for their countries. The third point, which was the question about, again, they're not African any longer, they're just elites. Yes, but their political economy, their success is still premised on control over the resources and institutions of a sovereign state. They haven't just gone global. You know, someone like Isabel dos Santos, who styled herself, yes, as a cosmopolitan, multilingual, sophisticate, London, Moscow, Miami, whatever, seeking respectability notably through the arts world. Ultimately, it all came from the oil and the diamonds and her father's stranglehold over the political economy of Angola. And without one, you wouldn't have the other. So there's a territoriality to these offshore stories. The money comes from somewhere, as your wonderful, if depressing case study of Bangladesh shows very well.
Go on,
Sue?
Sue.
No, Sue,
No, go ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say in response to Justin, I mean, I think that what's interesting about the Bangladesh case is it wasn't the resources. You know, like actually Bangladesh was doing okay economically, but that it was the political instability that it caused. And I think, you know, some of your comments, Chris, are really super interesting because it's like, sorry, John. It's not just how do you argue for debt relief, you know, it's how do you argue for foreign aid altogether when we're in this situation.
Sure.
You know, and I think that the offshore genie is out of the bottle, right? You know, we're not going to be able to put it back. The most that campaigners can often try and hope for is to kind of push for some kind of transparency, or as you were saying, Ricardo, pushing for somehow the self-interest of governments that and elites that actually investing it back at home is going to create greater stability long term. You know, but that's a really hard argument to win, particularly as you say in some contexts more than others. So I think I just wanted to say a quick story about like the measures that it relates to the kind of, what do you call it, performative, Nick, the performative measures that we take.
Yeah,
Theatre.
theatrical measures. Like
But it was the unexplained wealth orders thing that you also briefly mentioned, Ricardo, and I think that's a really good example. That there was a study just quite soon after they were introduced in Nigeria, showing that the day they were introduced, the tax authorities' website crashed because so many people were trying to quickly register their assets to make them legitimate. But very quickly, people realised you just go to Dubai and then you bring it back into London, because they wanted to come into London, they wanted their kids in London schools, but they didn't, they just got cleverer, basically, about how they did it. So, that is why we also do need global solutions, but I'm extremely pessimistic in the current environment that we're going to be able to get them.
Jonathan, if I may just add, this is something that I mentioned only briefly, but is so present not only in your amazing book, Treasure Islands, but in virtually all the work of Spotlight. There's so much intelligence and sophistication on the service provision side. on the enabler side. It's really intimidating for anyone studying this. Every time you think you figured it out, some highly paid lawyer, PR executive, real estate agency, wealth manager does something that I certainly didn't know could be done. And that amount of just sheer innovation, I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but there's a lot of talent out there laboring perhaps on the wrong side of the fence. And again, I'm mentioning lots of books today, but a book that I really urge you as containing so many illustrations of what I just said is a book that John Heathershaw, Tina Prelec, and Tom Main have just published a couple of months ago, titled Indulging Kleptocracy, which is about the enablers in the UK. It's a UK-centered book that focuses on the post-Soviet space and how UK service providers have provided, again, an immensely talented amount of smart services, and this is ongoing.
Ricardo, can I just, sorry, Nick, just exactly on that. So I appreciate the side of it, which is about sophistication and innovation. Is there another dimension to that enablement and intelligence, which is naivety? And I'm thinking about philanthropy and universities. I'm trying to bring this very close to home here. I mean, you know the story I've told you before, but I can tell you later. But you know, there was an effort by Isabel's brother, actually, and an associate of his in Zug, to say he wanted to really get involved and do something at SOAS. And
oh, you got that one too.
the
That's
due
SOAS,
diligence.
right? Everyone did.
SOAS, I have to say, well, it looks fine to us. It was a friend of mine in Nairobi who said, just don't go near this.
Is that
And later the guy ended up in jail.
I would put, with all due respect, I wouldn't put university development minds, not the academic development minds, but on the fundraising side, I would certainly not put them at the smart, sophisticated
That's
end
what
of this
I'm saying.
spectrum.
That's
I would
what
put
I'm saying. It's a sort of coalition of
very
the
naive.
dumb and the very smart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was talking about the lawyers, the bankers. You're right. You're so right.
Well, first Nick and then.
Yeah, I want to make 2 points. Responding, I mean, both Sue and Simon kind of made the point that the genie's out of the bottle. I mean, obviously, it's a very gloomy situation and a difficult situation, but I don't think that it's hopeless. I think that the changes that happened since the Panama Papers, I was very fatalistic about the possibility of anything changing with this kind of global competitive dynamics. But actually, quite a lot has been done. It's far from where we want to be. But, I mean, there's various... The EU Tax Observatory did a study recently with a graph in it showing how much private wealth has been kind of brought into the tax net. I don't know how they measured it. I don't know how good the quality of the data is. I think it was Gabriel Zuckman did it. But it was very significant. It was like 2% of global GDP, the equivalent of that much has been brought in, like half of the kind of offshore wealth, the private offshore wealth that was out there. And that's the result of, I would argue, significantly kind of public anger filtering through to politicians. A series of things, the global financial crisis and the Panama Papers, and I think the Tax Justice Network had a useful, movement had a useful role to play in kind of creating a coherent set of arguments. But I think there is the potential, I think it's far from hopeless. I mean, the world situation is horrible, I know. The other thing I would say is that most of the discussion we've had today is about kind of private wealth and wealth management and enablers of that kind. But I think Simon's point about corporate involvement in offshore is tremendously important. And again, to a very significant degree, the genie is out of the bottle, and there are some legitimate-ish reasons why you might want to go overseas, whether you want to go offshore, whether it's legitimate to go offshore, in the sense of being like, let's really go somewhere nasty, that's not legitimate. But taking your money elsewhere to a different legal system or taking your corporate structure, but there are kind of various degrees of legitimacy. But I think that one area that we have not really focused on, I think, is the issue that you touched on, which is corporate power. And I think corporate power is something that's kind of been off the radar screen of, certainly in my world, civil society. I've been involved in it recently, and there is some kind of stuff happening. There's been a lot happening in the United States. But I think there's been very little kind of focus on corporate power in the international political economy. And one way that I like to kind of glibly describe how important this is the tax justice community, which I've been a long-standing member, has been fighting for kind of taxing corporations better. That's great. But if you start looking at how these corporations, the big multinationals, make their money, so much of it is coming from market power. That my glib kind of way of describing it is like tax is like having someone nick your wallet and then giving you like 30% of the money back. Whereas going after corporate power and antitrust and really going for the heart of the matter is going after the theft itself. It's just a little thought I want to put up there. I think it's something that's off. It's not enough on our radar screen. It's something. It's going to be the subject of my next book, and
Nick,
I look forward to more discussions.
Just one question. If we're just narrowly focusing on the not so narrow and vitally important tax dimension, are you more optimistic than the broader offshore conversation?
On the tax dimension, you mean the corporate tax dimension, than the private? It's hard to quantify. I think that at the end of the day, in the very long term, it will depend on the kind of global public mood. And I know that's a very kind of wishy-washy way of looking at it, but I think we are going in the right direction there. Probably. I mean, the far right and all this sort of stuff is one of the things I would say about just. I do think that the far right it seems to be a growing and frightening phenomenon, but it has a fundamental contradiction at the heart of it, and that is that there are millions of members of the far right who are like hate nasty global forces and offshore and tax havens and corporate power and big tech, and there's a million supporters in there, but the far right movement generally is bankrolled by these same nasty global forces, and that's a massive contradiction. And I think that is something that offshore can be a useful component of going after that contradiction. Not quite extremely possible.
The Musk-Trump fallout, that's a classic
That's exactly, yes.
example.
Yes, and Bannon Musk as well, yeah.
I would just come back to the naivety question. Sorry, and that's why I was trying to hijack you. Because I don't think it's naivety. It may be on the part of the academics, but there is a whole...
No, it's not the academics, it's our superiors.
Your superiors. Sorry, the university administration, the managers. But there is someone behind that who is a wealth reputation manager who is saying, here's what you need to do. You need to, donate to a private school or a university. You need to, So actually, it's something that we often forget is the role of the PR industries. So it's not like there's someone, I think I'd like to build a nice, they've been told by someone, like, you need to make your wealth look really legitimate. And here's how to do it. You get a university hall named after you, Blavatnik. I mean, let's, face it. Certainly not the only. And so I think that industry is deeply unregulated, like in the UK, and just from the Bangladesh example, very briefly, like that came out recently when, someone from the interim government came to speak to Parliament, and I don't know if people saw the article about it, but, someone in PR emailed all the MPs to say, he's corrupt too, this guy's corrupt. And then it turned out that they linked to an article which was on a website by a fake journalist, with a fake photo who didn't exist. And if you talk to people in PR, it's a classic tactic where they just put fake information on this website and then recycle it. So there's a whole industry out there, and I've listened in to someone talking about how you make your wealth look legitimate, so to avoid unexplained wealth orders. Luckily, that's not a threat to anyone anymore, but in the early days. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Question in the back, and then Hajun has a question, and then any gentleman over there. We'll go with, Yeah?
Yeah, so it's wonderful to see how these offshore, people and mechanism had the impact on the development. But I met one of my friends from Uganda, and he said there is something called the UK High Commission to Uganda. And this person is higher than the president there, So for example, they had privatization to the electricity sector, and this high commissioner go to the president office and make a UK government-owned called Grid Works, take billions of dollars contract, and no one in the country can say, because the president there has been in power for 30 years, and there's no election, and when one of the ministers have spoken about this UK government corruption, they sanctioned the Speaker of Ugandan Parliament as he's corrupted. So I tried to search about these UK grid corrupted contracts in Africa, or the UK High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and other countries, but there's no information. So
High Commissioner is the name for ambassadors for human rights countries.
Yeah.
High Commissioner is
but
the
he
ambassador.
so he have power over the president there. So my point, why
Well,
I was
I mean,
talking about the
Yeah,
UK
maybe in
government.
reality, but
Yeah. So why no one is talking about the UK government companies in Africa and the previous colonized countries and their impact, which have 100 times more kind of influence on people's everyday life in Africa.
Hajun?
yeah, no, I was just trying to add a footnote to Sue's comment on universities. I mean, of course, this is a long practice. Yeah, Stanford University, but its official title used to be Leland Stanford Junior College, which comes from the fact that Leland Stanford was one of these robber barons. And his son was Leland Stanford Jr., was a very bright young man, went to Harvard, and then he got killed in an accident. So he wanted to donate the money to Harvard, and Harvard said, no, your money is too dirty. So Stanford said, okay, then I'll set up a university in my son's name, yeah? And bought half the Harvard faculty. Yeah?
Yeah.
And yeah, all these foundations, Ford, Carnegie, you know, I mean, I must declare that I once got a grant from Ford Foundation, but these are all people, you know, Carnegie used to hire Pinkerton, the agency, to shoot at striking workers. Yeah? And so the education sector has been used as a laundry for, you know, dirty money of various grades for at least the last century. It's not a new thing. Yeah?
Question over here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm from Canada. I think underratedly we do a lot of offshore finance, and we put on that kind face.
Yeah.
Everyone's money. But I was wondering from like the perspective of an economy like the UK, where offshore finance is a sizable piece of the like pie of national income and is only increasing. If you're advocating for the minimization of that industry, like what larger domestic economic changes need to happen in conjunction to that to ensure a healthy transition? And if you're advocating for like a GDP fundamentalist, how do you ensure that you know numbers don't fall off to people that think like that?
Okay. Sue, do you want to start reflecting on
I
that?
was hoping that Nick was going to say that.
Shall I talk to that last one?
Yeah.
We used to have we used to kind of joke with each other, like, because we in the Tax Justice Network, the kind of tax agents said, you tell us what we should do otherwise, because we can't do anything else. And, we kind of, our response was like, well, we're not going to fly over your island and say, put a tractor factory there and put this here. It's not our job to kind of like say what the alternative would be. But I would say that if you've got a whole sector of your economy that is sucking money out of all the other bits of the economy, and you put a stop to that suction, the economy will flourish. And it's not for me to say which bits, kind of, I think will be best. But I mean, it's a good point. But I think you would have, you just identify which parts of the financial sector. And I'm also very interested, as I've just said, in corporate power. I think corporate power it's another, so there's financialization, and corporate power and financialization are very closely connected, and the financial sector very closely connected with, sort of M&A departments and investment banks kind of pushing, monopolizing mergers and acquisitions and so on. So it's all kind of part of a whole. But I don't think it's like you take one part out and then, you'll have a few unemployed M&A bankers, but you'll have, there'll be, very well educated people who will hopefully they'll find a new deal for council or something like that. He says, semi-jokingly.
Shall I respond to Arjun? I mean, I agree. And maybe what's changed is now a whole industry around it, and that's different. But maybe they learned a few tricks from Mr. Sanford that it works as a technique. The Sackler family, in terms of the opiate crisis as well. It's all so I think, and it's fascinating. Some of the work that has been done on the PR industry. It's fascinating about how people have come to the UK. There's a particular story about an Indian money launderer, and he went for a very small PR firm because then basically he knew they would do whatever because he was mainly like 80% of their income because he paid so much. So he knew they couldn't afford to say no. But actually the audience, he was doing all these things in England, like getting photos with politicians but the audience wasn't the UK, it was to show back home because he was wanted back in India. And the audience was back in India to show, look, I'm untouchable. I can actually put my arm around a British Prime Minister, and, So I just think there's a whole industry around it that is very murky and, even if it's an age-old practice.
Yeah, on the Canada front, actually, as a footnote, Canadian banks and Canadian lawyers were not an insignificant set of players in the establishment of a lot of Caribbean dodgy business in the 60s, 70s, as you have documented. So there's a wonderful little story there. But in terms of what the UK should do or shouldn't do, again, this is not I'm not British and it's not my line of expertise. But what I would say to try to take and there's a normative dimension whereby people who feel strongly about this like we do, we think the UK should do it because it's the right thing to do, okay? And I think that's a significant justification. But what would be important, taking the longer view, is that it wouldn't be a satisfactory outcome if the dirty or questionable business, at any rate, simply moves from here to other jurisdictions. Then the UK will be poorer, it will feel better about itself, and these dynamics that we're talking about here will go on thriving. And often thriving because British professionals have engaged in this form of jurisdictional arbitrage and taken the business to both the places I mentioned earlier, but also new places that we are not even on our maps, okay? So I think that's really important. We need systemic global reform and not just UK-based reform. Right. But now we're here and we need to do something here because that's where we are. The final point, Arjun's point about reputation laundering universities, I think I cannot overstate the point enough. I mean, universities have been fantastically naive, right? Frankly, from a non-moral perspective, it's fine if you can get away with it. But if in 2 months or in 2 years' time it all blows up in your face like the Gaddafi case in the LSE, then you were too clever by half, right? And British universities came into this development game very late in the day, and they're just not super astute. And sometimes they're greedy and grasping, and they don't think of the long run, and they should do. But for me, the broader question, I'll end with that, is the question about whether these individuals, and behind them the states that underpin them, these oligarchs that are really politically connected back home, whether beyond just engaging in reputation laundering, right, and then they become known not as the crooks who sort of cleaned out aluminium in whatever post-Soviet economy, but they're the donors to this museum or that university, whatever. Beyond that, there's the larger issue about whether that buys them political influence, whether that actually starts changing the politics at home. And the case studies that I have in mind, Angolan oligarchs in Portugal, Russian oligarchs in London, and arguably the royal family of a major state in the Persian Gulf, in the case of Paris, they really have gotten to the very heart of the establishment. And that places questions that are no longer about global justice, they're questions about domestic politics in the UK specifically. So I think that's really a major concern.
I have a question for the panel.
I asked that question.
Yeah.
Was it not nice or?
I don't know about Uganda.
I mean, it seems like there's systematically kind of hiding these things.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that Britain is many years ago, there was Transparency International had this thing called the Corruption Perceptions Index, which is like which are the most corrupt countries in the world, and so you had Nigeria and African countries all at the top, and Britain was like bottom. Britain, Switzerland, and all these other places like we're the cleanest. And of course, people who are conscious of tax haven activity are like that's wrong because these people are handling huge amounts of corrupt activity. So a bunch of us got together and created this thing called the Financial Secrecy Index, which kind of turns it, which are the worst tax haven, a kind of combination of scale and secrecy, and as this kind of flipped the story. And so Britain was very high up. So Britain, yes, is in this way of looking at corruption is a very, very important player. Your point about the High Commissioners, I also agree. The High Commissioner is just a term for the ambassador in former colonies, is that right? Yeah, former
Commonwealth.
Commonwealth countries, that's it is. And so, are they more powerful than the president? I don't think so. I think probably there are some very small countries where foreign aid is such a huge percentage of the economy that the British High Commissioner or Ambassador could be so incredibly powerful they can tell the president what to do. I don't think it's the case in Uganda. I doubt it. But
I think the key, if I understand rightly, the key to this is the hypocrisy, right? Is that and it's well known. I mean, when I first started working on corruption, the embassies and the high commissions helped British companies identify the agents through which to pay the bribe. A case that we followed in the courts only finished, last year. The MOD was specifically identifying who in the Saudi regime the company should be bribing. So there is a fundamental hypocrisy, and that's the problem with the sanctions regime. Like, it can be a powerful tool, but if you're behaving in a completely hypocritical way, it undermines that, and it particularly undermined it under Boris when there was a lot of corruption at home as well, and people, when the FCDO put out a anti-corruption sanctions designation, the social media would go viral with pictures of Matt Hancock and various UK ministers saying, look closer to home, mate. But there is, hypocrisy is absolutely right, and you're absolutely right to point out UK companies, play a critical role by paying bribes in upholding people like Museveni, frankly, and letting them keep their grip on power.
I have a question for Ricardo, actually for the panel. When you look at mining deals in oil, minerals, and fuels in Africa, virtually none of them are a public document. And that, you're talking about the territoriality of wealth. What?
You mean the contracts?
Yeah, the contracts. Now, to me, a lot of that, I don't know the answer to this. It seems like most of it would be driven by domestic ruling party elites that don't want it to be. And I don't think they're being forced by international legal law firms to make it necessarily. So why is that a way of ensuring a flexibility of patronage? So because once things become transparent, matter of fact, remember the Cameroon pipeline?
Yeah.
It was transparent, fiduciary for like 2-3 years, and then the elites figured, wait a second, I can't solve my problems of sorting out the elite bargain of my limited access order because you might liberalize everything and take away some levers of patronage, but you're not going to take away that, right? So to me, there's a political economy explanation of why none of these deals are public, and it has to do with domestic politics more than it has to do with the existence of offshore. That's just a question that I have, and because I think sometimes transparency has a lot of functions that we need to think about, or the lack of transparency that has a lot of political functions to elites that are trying to maintain stability. So there's a normative thing to say it's awful, and then there's a positive political economy thing that is not just an exception, it's continental wide in Africa. It would be an exception, maybe Botswana has a public document over mining, and that's it. So that's one thing. And I think this discussion has to bring power more into it. I remember one of the largest landowners in Pakistan, it was a New York Times video, he held up a check in Parliament as the richest landowner of the country to show how much he paid in property tax, and it had 0.000 and held it up to the Parliament on television as a point of pride. And so I think, you know, and you can't hide the land he had, right? I mean, that land, the territoriality of his wealth was there, and it still wasn't taxed, and that's a story around a lot of low-income countries. Elites that are huge landowners do not pay tax. They can't hide it anywhere, and decade after decade, they don't pay tax. So I think, I mean, but to answer the first question, I think power, just to finish up, power, I think, needs to be explicit in how we're going to think about a strategy, number one. But two, why aren't any of these deals, or what do you think they're not?
It's also
Public
corporate power, right?
Yeah, but also not all of them. You can. There is some information out there about mining deals and oil deals. I got a friend who I bumped into the other day who investigates these things, and he through the EITI process, for example, you can find, you know, there is a certain amount of information that comes out, and he was very excited because he'd been reading in detail through these things, and he discovered a loophole that in one particular mining deal in one mine, I think it was in DRC, that was worth like $2 billion over a certain period of time. And this was an interest rate. It was just like the interest rate was incredibly high, and it was one of these sucking mechanisms. There is a lot of it is of course secret, and you're right that it's not necessarily an offshore problem. It's a it's a domestic political problem.
Ricardo, do you want to add something there? Or?
No, after you.
Okay. So I completely agree with the points you made. Let me regarding the contracts and the being opaque is a form of increasing discretionary power over resources. I have nothing to add there, but 2 points you made, Jonathan, in the process of making your case. One is that domestic politics really matter, and because of the nature of our conversation today, we're emphasizing transnational dynamics. I think they're really significant, and the political dynamics in the old and new offshore financial centers also matter, okay? Yeah. But we shouldn't forget the importance of politics in country, or somehow fall into some sort of dependency theory, structuralist explanation in which, these countries are purely passive players in the hands of broader global dynamics. It's complicated. Sure. And I think that you've made the point twice that domestic politics also matter, and I very much agree with that. Hence the variation that you find across many different African countries. I mean, many African countries are better run than others. I think in Angola and Dutch was a kleptocracy in a very, very pure sense. Yeah. Other countries are much more complex, and the dynamics don't fit that portrait so clearly. So again, importance of domestic politics. The broader argument that I wanted to just raise is about the issue of taxation in Africa. This is something that I think the literature, because so much of the academic literature on taxation is not Africa focused until 15, 20 years ago, there's sometimes the assumption that in Africa, offshore is used for tax evasion. Even someone like Gabriel Zuckman, whose work I very much admire, we welcomed him in Oxford a few months ago, he made a point at an earlier stage. I would argue something slightly different. I think the tax story, and notably the desire to engage in tax avoidance, is definitely a key motivation for foreign corporates to engage in offshore as they work in Africa, right? And often they do it through totally legal ways by using jurisdictions that have double taxation agreements with Africa. Double taxation agreements that are a rip-off for African countries, but which African governments signed, okay? And that's why, for instance, a country like Senegal and a country like Zambia have reneged on their DTA with Mauritius because they thought this was a rip-off. This was not in the interest of these two countries, okay? So I think there's a lot to be said there. But in the case of African elites, I don't think the taxation story is that important. Because, to put it bluntly, wealthy people in Africa, in many different African contexts, don't risk getting taxed that heavily, right? They may risk getting expropriated by a vengeful political order that comes after they benefit perhaps too much, but they don't actually risk being taxed. So for them, the motivation to go out there is political risk. Back to your domestic politics.
And on tax, I did an investigation into Donald Trump, and the key the key question was, is he using tax havens?
Yeah.
I wasn't really able to find anything, and I managed to get an interview with him, and this was in 2016. I said, are you using tax havens? He said, no, I don't use them because I get everything I need at home. And I still was all about
Yeah, you used to Delaware or Idaho.
Well, yeah, Delaware, but also it was stuff like putting goats on golf courses so that it was reclassified as agricultural land. It was that kind of stuff, and he,
They got the lawyers to figure
I
it
kind
out.
of believe him. I mean, he did. There was like an aircraft of his in Bermuda and stuff.
Yeah,
but-
didn't he bury his first wife in one of the golf courses so that he could?
Oh, possibly.
Sue, did you want to add anything?
Something like that.
You mean cemeteries get tax relief, do they?
Exactly.
I wish I'd known that. That would have been a great story. Yeah.
Only just another side to that contract thing. I haven't been involved in the EITI, but I think there were plenty of oil companies who had to be dragged kicking and screaming or did not come to the table in terms of the signing up the transparency. So I think it was a perfect alignment of corporate power with local power interests. But one area that, actually we've done quite a lot of work on is like, if you look at investor-state disputes and arbitration, they also go into a very secretive black hole, and you'll get corruption allegations that arise in there. That we followed an extraordinary case in Nigeria where a small offshore company that had no experience got a contract and managed through arbitration to be holding the Nigerian government to ransom for $10 billion. And it managed to actually overturn that.
Yeah.
But that was a case of
horrendous.
corrupt attorneys in Nigeria. I just wanted to mention that secretly, partly because my colleague Helen here as well, who leads our court monitoring work, and she'll be cross with me if I don't.
I seem to remember in that case, like the lawyers, the enablers in that case, were set to earn like $800 million each. Some massive personal
the
enrichment.
personal benefit for the British lawyers.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, we're out of time. So I'd like to thank Susan, Nick, and Ricardo for fantastic conversation. And this will be up on our YouTube website for those who want to listen to this again, or to tell others about it who couldn't come. So thank you guys again.
Thank you.